today's talk was titled Without Fear or Favour, and it is a great opportunity to hear from community justice lawyer Aarif Rasheed about the subject of our justice system and how it interacts with our faith communities and other minority communities across New Zealand. So thank you very much for joining us today. A few things about Aarif. Many of you in the room know him well, but for those on the video who may not, he works as a community justice lawyer. He also provides advice to the public sector on related issues and does some lecturing. And over the last few years, he's been very busy, had a roller coaster journey as he has supported diverse Christchurch communities affected by the mosque shootings at Noor and Linwood Islamic Centre in 2019. So I guess reflecting on that as well as many other experiences through his practice as a community justice lawyer, he's got a lot to kind of share and reflect on. So I'm really excited to hear him speak today. And it'll be great to record some of his thoughts so that other people can catch up on them as well. So I'll, without further ado, hand over to Aarif, and at the end I'll jump up. I've got a couple of questions of my own planned out, but also it'd be great to hear your questions following on, which we'll pick up shortly. So over to you, Aarif.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon everybody. Thank you very much for coming along to, I think some of you have come all the way from down the road as well, so from the other events, so I'm thankful for that event for boosting our numbers. Those of you at home, you might have travelled all the way to your computers, but I just want to firstly pray that we're all well, inshallah, and that we pray for the well-being of all of you who were not able to make it to the AGM as well today. So thank you so much for all your services to the CCM and to this the wider cause of bringing people together in these times we live in of tension and disagreement. So as Brendan says, we're going to try and just keep this a little bit shorter today because it's a small group of us and it'll be nice to get people participating. The topic for today is really just to think about how the justice system is doing. That's really what this talk is about. And I suppose the last few years with Christchurch has really given us a window into how the justice system really is doing. I don't know if many of you take interest in the justice system or read the news. Some of you probably read about crime and think, well, that's just how things are with those people, those, whether you call them those people, it could be those Māori people, it could be those people who live in state houses, it could be those people who always get into trouble, it could be those gang members, and that's often how we really, I suppose, reflect on, and that's how we rationalise the world. Of course, we're going to have to do better than that as people of faith, because as both of our faiths exhort us to do, we have to be people who have solidarity with those who are vulnerable. And one of the interesting discussions we had recently was about those who are vulnerable from the LGBTQ community, because of course, although we may disagree on certain things very clearly, but that there are also people from that community who are also vulnerable, and there are also people from the communities who, for example, would have benefited from cannabis being legalized, because of the way that they use cannabis and because of the way they have a lack of access to other alternatives. So those are two things that have come up in the last couple of years, I think, that people of faith probably would find relevant. But if you want to talk about that today, we can. I mean, we don't get too many opportunities to catch up about the law and faith, but those were two things that have come up. So the question that I wanted to ask you, just in opening, is how do you think about the law when you think of people in the news? Do you think of them as vulnerable, or do you only think of yourself as vulnerable? So, thanks to the crime in my area, I'm now going to have to, get an extra layer of security for my car, or keep an eye on my. And we obviously have very real concerns also in the Muslim community, because crime also affects us, and we sometimes also feel more vulnerable because of what could be our dress or other things like that. Although I think now, hopefully, we are starting to realize that the crime that we see, as we generally recognize as crime, and the actual hate crime from the far right, as it were, are two different things. So hopefully we're starting to, not just generalize as crime and just start to see people as criminals and therefore as a danger to us. And I think, as the people here who are more knowledgeable will tell us, that there has to be a sense of vulnerability when we go to spend time with the poor or spend time with the homeless. Around my office where we are, we do have homeless people coming around, and sometimes, particularly with female staff members, it can be, they see it as a safety issue, which of course it is. But I'm just using that example to demonstrate that if we want to do the service of our religion, we will also need to put ourselves at some level of risk. There is a kind of a false assumption now in the modern world where basically elimination of risk is the, if modern people had one wish, it'd be the elimination of risk. So the way that we tend to live our lives in the modern world is basically through the lens of risk, whether it's risk of getting infected or risk of getting something stolen or other things like that. And we can see, if we look back at the people who of our religion, that they clearly were willing to take a risk to get a higher thing done, whether it's spending time with the poor, serving the poor, or serving the sick, or other things like that. I'm not sure what the current latest policies on serving the sick are, but without the PPE gear. But clearly we just need to have these discussions so that are we going to stop everything that we were doing as people of faith because now we live in an elimination of risk world. So anyway, those are just some of the opening questions. It's not really what I wanted to talk about today. I'm not really fully qualified to talk on the topic, but one area that has helped me to be more qualified is the experience with Christchurch families. The Christchurch families, what I mean by the Christchurch families is the families affected by the shootings in the two Christchurch mosques. They represent, literally dozens, probably 40 to 50 nationalities, languages, ethnic groups. I feel very underqualified, very unqualified to serve such a diverse group. The Christchurch shooting community, if you would have reflected on this, you probably would have realized they're probably the most diverse victim group that I can think of in the world. If you think of some of the other shootings, like if you think of maybe the Charleston shooting or even the Oslo attack, which of course the terrorist Tarrant modelled his attack on, they were all, for example, Norwegians. The people affected in the mosques were people of just an enormous and amazingly diverse group. And one of the things that we're finding is it's very difficult for that group to work together. Not because they're not good people, but because they speak completely different languages, and not just literally, but they come from completely different approaches. We recently had the death of the first widow. By that I mean the death of the first person who was widowed by the attacks. And her personality was completely, I felt very aggrieved by that, because I hadn't really had the chance. We often get praised for, thank you for all the work you're doing in Christchurch. But sadly, this was one of those times where if someone knew, they would ask me, why don't you do anything for that lady? And I felt a sense of grief that I really wasn't. And that one reason was simply because she wasn't that type that she suffered the loss of a great community leader, her husband, but she suffered it in silence in her home. And that was her culture. That was the best way that she did it. I'm not saying that she did it the wrong way, that she should have been out there, with everyone else. But I suppose there are different temperaments and different cultures and and that's resulted in different ways of dealing with the loss. And I'm only just coming to terms with that now, but it does help us to reflect on how diverse a group we are. Because, of course, the victims they needed to be served by the justice system. When Tarrant was prosecuted, when the terrorist was prosecuted and taken to court, these families were not served well by the justice system. The victims did not have any real say. I remember when some of the families were flying back from the UK, for example. They flew all the way from England and had come here to Christchurch, sitting at the back of the court, and the judge did not even acknowledge that they were there. The judge didn't even acknowledge that there were victims at the back of the court. Now, there's a little discussion about that because criminal judges are supposed to just focus on the fairness of the defendant. But, you don't have to be too progressive to realise that just acknowledging Now, that slowly happened after nearly a year. The judge started to acknowledge the victims at the back of the court. But you can see that, and this happens for a lot of victims. You don't have to be a Muslim victim or a non-white victim or other, diverse community kind of based victim to actually experience that. Many victims in our justice system have various grievances, and the chief victims' rights advisor, who is really a very under-resourced office. It's just the way politics works. If something's not a priority, it has a lot less resources. And so victims' rights and victims think something is only now coming up. Whereas in our faith tradition, as you know, the rights of victims has always been very important. And ironically, in such a progressive justice system, the rights of victims is something that is a real indictment on our system. Most victims who've been through the court system will give you an absolutely terrible, and I'm not even exaggerating, account of their experiences in this justice system, which, for good reason, we hail to be a very good system. So I'm not here to bag the system, but we also have to, what I am here to do is that we as people of faith have a unique role, and this is the main point that I want to put forward today, that we as people of faith have a unique role in identifying the shortcomings of the system, but in also finding a balance between criticizing the system and upholding it. And that's a personal journey that I'm having at the moment, because a lot of what I see in the justice system is wrong. But obviously we also have a corresponding duty to uphold the system. The whole reason how I got involved in Christchurch was I was asked to come down and basically preach to the victim, which is pardon the pun for this audience, but I was asked to go and preach to the victims, to tell them how good our system was, so that they would, have some patience with it, because of course they didn't know anything about it, and they felt quite aggrieved by the way the system was working. But the last 3 years has been a difficult journey, and we have made small improvements in the justice experience for Christchurch families, but the challenge has been very obvious, very, very obvious. The system that we have in New Zealand is, of course, no legal system is, of course, neutral. Every legal system is based on a certain culture, a certain worldview. It has a certain background. That's, of course, why we have different systems of law. And the main law that we would say here is the British, which is essentially a Western legal system that we have here in New Zealand. And the experience of Māori in that system has not been a good one, of course, as we know, because, of course, that legal system was also the tool of colonisation and a tool of oppression ever since. And the most important figure in that intellectual legal advocacy, the late Moana Jackson, just passed away a few months ago, but he was probably the most important New Zealander for me, because he was such a softly spoken man and such an intelligent man who never gave up about talking about the way that the law has kept Māori in their predicament. So we know that the legal system comes from a particular background, and we know that it was, of course, in the British interests and the Crown interests to suppress the Māori identity in order for it to be taken over by the British one. So we know that because we've I think now there is an increasing awareness of that. But we also recognise the fact that, for example, many aspects of British law have commonalities with the aspects of for example, Islamic law and other non-Western traditions. So we recognise that the British system does have important critical universal systems, and that it's a good system in terms of its nature. But we also know that the way that it's being applied, often in New Zealand, is problematic for our communities. One of the other communities outside the Christchurch families that I have seen, apart from Māori, that I have seen it be problematic for is former refugees, people who have come to this country with very little understanding and familiarization. So we do such a good job as a country, again, credit where it's due, great job as a country of bringing in maybe not as many refugees as people would like, certainly lower than many other countries, but we do bring in refugees, and that's to our credit. And but we don't often do a good job of familiarizing themselves with the norms of our community, and they sometimes make mistakes. They sometimes have a lot of stress in terms of where they've come from, past trauma and other things. And one of the things that we've seen in the court system is that these former refugees are treated very severely and very harshly in the justice system, almost as a way of, we're going to be harsher on you so you can be educated about the way we do things in New Zealand. And if you think about what I've just told you about the way that the law has always worked in terms of telling Māori its place and keeping Māori in its place, then you can see that corresponding kind of role that the law is playing in terms of putting people in their place. And that's the main, if you ask the Christchurch families, that's the main thing that they feel as a grievance, is that the law keeps putting them in their place. It's a way of saying that, well, this is how our law works. We don't know where you come from or what your law is, or even if you have one, but it's certainly not the one we want here. And this is how we do things, and there's a very significant, obvious disconnect. And so as CCMers, that's all I'll say about the system, because I want to wrap up now. I just have some time for questions. But in terms of our community as CCM, as people who come together regularly to talk about our differences, people who, I think all of you here have come together before maybe and talked about your differences, maybe not personally because we haven't had that many meetings. I remember we had a Charter for Compassion discussion or event some years ago, and we got together in small groups and had more of that. Maybe we need more of that for our future meetings. But the reason why that's important to what I'm saying here today in terms of the law is that firstly, at a very high level, and if you think about the highest level of international law and the United Nations, the law that's imposed on the world is essentially a Western law. So the United Nations human rights laws are all generally Western-based laws, and a lot of the non-Western countries often complain about what they feel is the double standards. So for example, one thing that we all know about is the Iraq War, and the fact that the United Kingdom, that Britain was really alleged to have waged an illegal war, and that there were war crimes and other things like that. And now the International Criminal Court was supposed to investigate those, but it ultimately ended up leaving it to England to investigate itself. And many of the, I think it was some of the Arab countries, non-Western countries anyway, who pointed out that that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't Britain, or if it was a non-Western country. So at the very highest level, and forgetting about the double standards, of course, you know, there are many double standards. We all have them, and of course the West does too. But more importantly, perhaps, is that if we want everyone to follow international human rights norms, so let's say, for example, if we were able to articulate universally accepted human rights that everyone can live by in the world, well, then it can't just be one culture enforcing it and imposing it on another culture. There needs to be a common understanding, obviously, of what is our, whatever you want to call it, international law going to look like. It's going to be a mix of Western and non-Western principles. It's going to be things that people can accept and not just been imposed. That, you know, and obviously that requires the West to learn more about Islamic legal principles, because obviously if they think, you know, and that has happened in cases where Islamic law has just been classified as a form of torture or something like that. So this dialogue that we're having at our level here is the same dialogue that has to happen at the very highest level, where Islamic legal principles start to be respected, and where just non-Western legal principles start to be respected. And then the world can come up with a legal system that actually is not just Western. And so, for example, the International Criminal Court can start to look at Western nations more equally with others. And so you wouldn't have had the situation where the UK was just given the chance to investigate itself on the war crimes in Iraq, for example. with other people standing back and saying, well, that wouldn't have happened if that was us. So there needs to be, I suppose, a greater equity in that international environment. In terms of, and this is the last point I'll leave you with the discussion for, is that in terms of our level here in New Zealand, how are we going to do that? It's always important to practice what we preach, of course. So how are we going to do that in New Zealand, where the law is obviously serving certain people in one way and to the detriment of others, and certainly in terms of us who are, I suppose, second-class legal citizens, be they Maori or former refugee, or for example, the special group, the Christchurch families. Well, I'm only putting forward two things, and I hope other people can add in theirs. But the first thing that I would point out to you as people of faith is that we have to recognize that the law is not just there for us, it's there for everybody. So when I was talking about the legalization of cannabis or the LGBTQ or other things like that, sometimes as faith communities, I think the law certainly has an anti-religious element. So we do want to put that point forward, but we also have to remember that when we're looking for law change, our faith, our very own faith, requires us to consider how that law will affect everybody, not just us. And usually that's built into our religion. So, for example, if we don't want immorality to be widespread, for example, like as one of the lectures that we were listening to recently pointed out, that a lot of the immorality and lewdness is tolerated when it's in an LGBTQ context. That's why a lot of people of faith feel, is that if there was for example, a nude photo on a poster somewhere, and it was just any old group, that there would be some people talking about it. But if it's like an LGBTQ kind of event, then maybe it won't be. And so they're trying to express that grievance that they have about that. Essentially a point of discrimination, I suppose. But I would, of course, go back to that point of us actually appreciating difference, not just at a faith level, but of course here, as we're speaking really at an ideological level. And maybe it's for us to also understand a little bit more about those other communities and how we're going to engage with them in a way that fits our legal traditions and our religious traditions in terms of our humanity and in terms of our compassion. But ultimately, the main issue is really understanding the common ground and advocating for a legal system that is going to serve everybody. So we have to accept that. We have to accept that we are living in the same reason that we criticise the Western British legal system, because it's so narrow and monocultural and it's not for everybody. Well, it also can't just be for us, right? So there is always going to be aspects of the law that we disagree with. But the critical point, I think, especially for young people as they grow up and identify themselves with New Zealand, is that there has to be, and at the international level as well, there has to always be the opportunity to change those laws for the better. And of course, as the democratic process becomes a little bit more and more inaccessible, that's a problem. And so we need to be able to have discussions like, not just like this, I'm just putting forward some academic things, but I'm more talking about debating and discussing these real issues on a more regular basis, so that we can challenge which laws we feel are unjust. People can actually speak out about it, and we can challenge what norms sit behind those laws. We can critique laws not just in our own faith community, but we can feel safe critiquing it outside, in public spaces, and that we can have this as a pluralist society, so that we can actually have different groups coming together. And CCM might do one of those, where we actually, we have a discussion on a set of laws, and we bring together different people, and we recognize that we're all going to have different traditions and different ideas. I mean, even within our faiths, we have a spectrum. So, and we have facilitators to bring out people's ideas and critiques, and we convey that to the people that need to hear it. I'm not sure how that will work, but I'm really just here to tell you that number one, the law is definitely not neutral. It has always been there to serve certain interests and certain cultures and certain worldviews more than others. So that's accepted, and we know that from the New Zealand experience, and we're just being reminded of that by the Christchurch families refugee families and other people who are bearing the brunt of the legal system. And number two, what are we going to do about it? Well, it's a discussion like this. It's about appreciating difference. It's about appreciating the fact that the law is not just for me as a, Muslim human rights lawyer. It's also for the person next to me. It's also for the person, my neighbour. So the law is also for my neighbour. And how will we negotiate that and come to a legal system gradually, if not immediately? What process will we put in place so that our young people will feel that they can question the law and that we can reform the law so that there is hope? Because if we don't, it's all very easy to say that an unjust law is not a law, so we can ignore the law, but we don't want to be in the business of promoting ignoring the law. That is something that sometimes many important people did, like Martin Luther King or others like that, who we look up to, Malcolm X. And there may be times when that has to happen. We shouldn't discount that. There may be times, especially in the times that we're heading into, because unfortunately, a lot of the laws, if we don't do anything about it, they're going to bring the legal system into such disrepute that people are going to start ignoring the law. I mean, that's already happening at one level where when people can't even afford the most basic of necessities, then clearly we're starting to have more and more property offending, property-related offending and dishonesty offending. And we've seen that in other countries as well. So we need to urgently start to have these discussions where people feel that they can be a part of a discussion to change the law and to make it fairer and more reflective of our communities. Yep, my time is well and truly up, so we will call up Brendan and we'll open the floor. Okay.
Actually, Aarif, I wonder, rather than have me up here, I might just ask if you can repeat the questions that come from the floor so that they're close by the laptop, and then I'll come up maybe at the end with a couple, but maybe take some questions.
Obviously the question that's being raised is this a justification for the increase in crime that we're seeing, in particular violent crime? Obviously, I don't speak for any other tradition, but obviously in our tradition and in the law as well as it stands, no, that is not a justification. That would be in many cases a mitigation. So in the law where we admit guilt for what we've done, but we also bring out circumstances to say that, for example, as we know from our tradition as well, that if there was some particular mitigating factor that they had, for example, that they did not have, access to whatever they needed to have access to, and did that. But obviously, as the crime gets more and more serious, that's going to be less and less relevant, or the mitigation would have to be more and more serious. So the excuse for robbing a bank is obviously going to need to be a lot better than stealing a loaf of bread. No, the issue is actually not so much that. The issue is not so much justification. Well, the issue for today really is, do we understand those communities? Because the law has put them in a corner. So there is no real law for them. There is no real rehabilitation for them. Restorative justice has been talked about for 30, 40, 50 years, hasn't really gotten off the ground. And many cynics would say that the reason why restorative justice has not got off the ground is the same reason why the Māori and Moana Jackson and other legal scholars have always said is why Māori perspective into the law has never gotten off the ground, is because we've always resisted it. We've always resisted anything that will threaten the one British monocultural legal system. So I can tell you that I've only been practicing for 17 or whatever years, and I can remember that all of the lovely articles appearing in the Law News now in the Legal Journal, it's the same lovely articles that appeared in 2005, and nothing much has really changed. So we're always having Māori and Pacific Island lawyers on the front page, etc., but their communities are still suffering just as much, if not more. So the issue is more that what has our legal system done to address those issues other than sending them to jail? So you can break it down. Is sending them to jail helping? Well, it doesn't look like it. Are their needs being met when they come out of jail? We know that they're not. They're still not. That's one of the fields that I practice in. I can tell you categorically, without any really, I suppose, exception, that there's very, very little that the corrections department does to help people when they get it. So, and then of course the issue with gangs is the issue of identity, right? So you probably would have seen, and that there's one aspect of gangs that is just purely criminal, and then there's the other aspect of gangs which is seeking identity, and so you have to start to understand how that has interacted with the law, and how the law has alienated those people, and how it continues to do so as well. And of course, the way that the media often report about it is also part of the issue. So I probably won't go too much down that track, other than to say that the main thing to think about is whether the law has any connection, any literacy around those people. It's the same thing for me in the Christchurch families. All I'm trying to do is educate the coroner or the legal people, the judges, on who are our families. Did you even know that these are the different languages that they speak? Yes, okay, someone signed off an interpreter for them, so you can say that you finally got an interpreter for them. Well, that took years just to get interpreters arranged. It just shows the culture that we have in New Zealand. Like, we don't even have enough respect for people who speak different languages. We have a very, and many of us, unfortunately, in New Zealand don't speak a second language at all. And we have a distinct lack of respect for foreign languages. And we have a distinct lack of respect for people who speak foreign languages in New Zealand. And we see that in the justice system every day. It's like a problem that you've got to solve, that someone doesn't speak English properly, rather than having the responsibility of explaining the legal system to them. So it's the same thing with the gangs. It's just that it's more unfortunate because people like Moana Jackson, before he died, he was doing that work for 30 years. And the report that he wrote 2 years ago was pretty much the same report he wrote 30 years ago with very little change. And that's not me saying that. These are people like, Kim Workman and other people who have run the prisons and run the police themselves are saying these things and acknowledging these things. So, of course, we don't justify the crime, but we also have to know a little bit about the history. And even when we think about our own context, history is obviously very important to explain a lot of important issues. So my role today was just to ask the questions, not provide the answers. I'm only going through this, and Noel's got his hand up. He might have an answer. All I was going to say was I'm just on this journey myself, and really what I have discovered over the last few years, because my practice basically consists of people who are disenfranchised within the legal system, and usually that's Māori, so I have two parts to my practice at Just Community. And then the other part is the Christchurch communities. And what I've just been noticing, and was what I'm reflecting on today, is the symmetry, I suppose, between those experiences of a monocultural legal system. That there's just such a commonality in the experience of being othered and being alienated by that system. And it's helped me to. But the thing is, I've just been learning that, now. And there are papers, I did read a couple of papers before I came around and had a couple of discussions around how, the method for going forward. But really, it's for faith communities, it's for you, for all of us to come up with that. But naturally, one of the most important things about that is, clearly, for example, in the Islamic tradition, that any legal system is better than any form of chaos. Correct me if I'm wrong, there are many people here more learned than me, but obviously any legal system, no matter how unjust it is or dysfunctional it is better than chaos and having no legal system at all. Obviously, we're not saying let's not have a legal system. There is even the very small part of it which we said in terms of people potentially ignoring certain laws because it's just become so distant from their reality. And that's when we were talking about the gangs and the other issues in terms of the law has just become so distant from people's realities that it becomes less and less relevant to them. And it's not always a case of consciously committing crime. Just a couple of days ago, we had a young lady who was carrying out. The police very kindly called her one time when I first started I think they're more PC now, but when I first started, they called her a one-girl crime wave. And some of the men in here probably be, a little. I probably might take a step backwards if they came across it. And the thing is that for 17 years, she had never been given any kind. Her reality had never been acknowledged in terms of the abuse that she suffered in state care, for example, and then in terms of other things that she suffered along her life, it was never acknowledged by the state. So, but getting back to your question, it's really just more about the fact that the faiths have to start from the first principles, I think they call it, which is that it's going to take a long time, but we have to continue to engage in that discussion, and it has to be what we as people of faith have to do, particularly people of faith who are familiar with difference, is we have to start that journey by acknowledging that it's not going to only serve our needs. So just like we're complaining, I think I mentioned the example of the LGBTQ poster that gets away with a lot more nudity than our posters do. Well, it's the same. Someone else might say that for, I don't know, for example, the Eid sacrifice that we do, which, we get to go and sacrifice an animal we don't own, which is technically might not be allowed for other people, but those religious people get their special treatment, people could say, for example. So it's about everyone acknowledging that the law needs to serve, different groups, and it's a question for us, how are we going to be comfortable, and that's a question now with the LGBTQ thing, how are we going to reconcile and be comfortable and be a part of, but also assert ourselves? And I think that's the problem that someone raised in one of our groups recently, was that people are not being allowed to speak. And that's the biggest shame in all of this, is that people are not feeling that they can't speak out on that LGBTQ issue. My perspective on that was that we just need to educate ourselves on how to speak, because a lot of our faith communities sometimes aren't able to. And if we haven't been, for example, I think the two examples that I could think of was interest and alcohol. Alcohol is obviously a big one, and interest for Muslims in particular is also a big one. If we haven't been advocating for justice in for example, the alcohol area, we can't just quickly step into that arena, in the LGBTQ arena, and expect to kind of have those partnerships and the partnerships and the relationships in place for us to assert ourselves. And so, in other words, if we're going to something new for the first time, we've got to have the humility to take it slowly, even if the LGBTQ issue does give us so much, discomfort. Okay, so that's my very unsatisfactory answer.
Yeah, my name is Peter Lomodo, and in 2016, I've been helping a family, and a young man within my community, because I'm a community leader, he came and asked me if I could help him to bring his wife from Sudan, and through the process I helped, and the lady came over here, and all of a sudden she went through depression to the point one time she called the police on her husband, and then they came over and they removed her from the house, and they hand her to an organization that they're protecting her. And all of this, we were not involved. And then 3 weeks ago, that was in 2020, November. And after 2 years, they called us to come for the meeting that we want to discuss the custodies of the kids. So we went there, the organization who claimed that they're protecting this lady, and by the time when the lady walked in the room where we were all sitting, she's completely become like a mental woman. And I say the application of law, when you implement it, you decided to take her, you say that you're going to protect her. And this is kind of the protection you people are going to protect her. And that's how she looked like. And a woman from that organization who claimed to be protecting her, she want to walk away from the room. I said, sit down. You listen to what I'm saying. You know, anything happen to this woman, I'm going to sue you in the court. Personally, I will take this, I will sue it to the court. So what I'm trying to say here, sometimes the law, particularly the domestic violence law, treated the immigrants like the whole community is the enemy to one particular member of the community. So how can we be able to resolve this kind of issue?
Thank you so much. All of my experience in the refugee cases all been domestic violence. So you know, I just very quickly touched on the experiences with former refugees. It's all been in the domestic violence context. I haven't dealt that much with African communities, mainly Arab communities. Just trying to think. There was an Ethiopian, but anyway, domestic violence is where this issue is very obvious. The issue of you guys come from some weird world, and generally we need to protect your woman from you. I'm just thinking about the assumptions that are underlying all of the treatment that we get, and that they get. Also, the one I mentioned earlier, that we need to educate you. So we're going to give you a severer punishment so you can get yourself educated out of this. This is wrong. Don't do this again. So I think in Australia, I think I've received the results yet, but there'd be some very important studies that we can do, and for example, the Australian court system, about how the refugees have been treated in the former refugees, or those types of communities, in the domestic violence context in particular. It's a very good example. All I'm really saying, Peter, is that the domestic violence, it's a very sad example because it destroys families, because there's a lot less room to maneuver for Muslim families, for Arab families, for African families, for families of colour. Of course, you only have to open up the news to see what has been happening to Maori families. There was just a lady yesterday in the news who was offered $50,000 by Oranga Tamariki, the Maori name now, because everything's got a Maori name now, of course, but hasn't really changed. The Child, Youth and Family Services, because they had wrongly accused her of being unfit as a mother, and then they turn around now because they were rather finally someone like you actually did sue somebody and did succeed and got proven that that they had, and they offered her $50,000, which she of course rejected. So that was just in the news the other day. But the point is that some of I think you called it the organisation that was claiming to be protecting. This is also a problem because they also operate in our South Asian communities. And to be honest, we do have as one of the brothers reminded me, we don't need to, everyone doesn't need to air their dirty laundry, but we all know that family violence is part of the issue of financial stress and the domestic stress, and that there is a domestic violence problem. So we need those organisations. But the problem, so we're not saying they should go away, just like we're not saying the law should go away, but we're saying that the assumptions that they have about our ethnic communities are terrible. And they don't allow, usually by the time the police have, done whatever they need to do, and that's another can of worms to try and open up, but that family is often, the chances of that family getting back together by the time that the lady's gone off in one direction to, the fact, and I'm not saying that every woman needs to be given the opportunity. They may not want the opportunity to reconcile. And that might be a decision that they're ready to make. But the problem is that the law doesn't consider how vulnerable they are or give them an opportunity to meet with a member of their own community. So the community is cut off, and that's what you probably was feeling. And that's where that statement comes in, that you and your community are not objective, civilized, whatever the word is you want to use. We need to bring in this case, the vulnerable person, in this case, the woman or the child is another one, into our, Westernly, whatever environment, for them to be safe, by which time many things happen. They either have gone off in another direction, they've completely, separated themselves mentally from the relationship, or in your case, they're mentally unwell, more and more mentally unwell because they don't have whenua and other things here. But the reality for the children in the end is a very limited chance of having a family unit together again. And the irony about all that is that when you look at the Abuse and Care Royal Commission that's happening now, they're all saying that the most important thing for well-being is whenua. So there's just so much contradiction. I mean, that would be a good starting point for us to use as people of faith, is the importance of family, and how the legal system excludes the family from the legal process, especially where there's a vulnerable person, because the system tends to assume that it's the culture of the family that is causing the whereas maybe for, as you said, an upper class white family, they'll know that it's actually just, it's an aberration, it's just an exception, and they might be given more of a chance to work it out and for people to have discussion and to actually problem solve the situation.
Before I forget, this came from your mouth. First of all, I'll acknowledge the Western countries' effort and they've given so much rights to people who have abused in their own country, so they accepted them, they brought them, they gave them so much of help. So I really like to acknowledge that. On the other side, from your mouth, I've heard two things. One, police comes in, for example, and separates a family, and that brings more enmity and they say in Arabic, adawa, between the couples, whatever it may be. Before they do that, and also I heard from you that the community people can probably get into and solve the problem before they take the couples very far away from each other. So my humble request would be that, since you are a lawyer and looking into all those things as well, some sort of proposal could be put that if there is definitely some problem in our society, each cultural background people are there, investors, counselors, whoever that may be, first put it to them before separating permanently, and then becomes a big issue between husband and wife. One husband killed his, he was given the time to go home from the jail for a night. Said, okay, you go and solve your problem. Because he was in the jail whole night, he came angry without telling the court, and he actually killed his wife as well. So instead of putting them into a cell, bringing someone from the community, they should have some database. Please look into it before we take any further action. Maybe that will be a future good time for society.
Did you want me?
Do you want to do that?
I think the only thing, I'll just stand right here, the only thing that we need to prove to the society is that we're going to respond to that family violence in an objective way, because one of the problems that we have in our communities is that if we are not already, like, for example, and again, I'm wearing a bit of dirty laundry, so someone might take me up on this, but the problem is that we are not talking about family violence in our communities. And one of the key concerns that people may have, if I was a family violence, victim activist, is whether or not that community is going to deal with family violence the way it should be dealt with. So we have to prove that we have our own cultural way of dealing with family violence. We actually have thought about it, and it's actually effective. That's what we're going to have to prove. Because if we can't, and if there's a suggestion that all we do is when they go into our community, it's more likely to keep happening, right? It's more likely to keep happening because we're not dealing with it effectively. Then we haven't created the opportunity.
It's just a very quick thing. Yes, I just want to ask you, is there some sort of compassion fatigue, sort of where people are getting tired of hearing about the Christchurch things and saying, is there a sense like, you guys, it's over, we want to move on now? Yes. Yeah. Is there that sort of thing that you're running into?
There is. Most families, when I had my latest family meeting a couple of weeks ago, only 5 people turned up out of the 40 families they were representing. People have moved on. They've given up the legal system. They don't have any reason to be involved. They don't even know, they have been given very little explanation about how the government missed Tarrant. So for those of you who know, just in a nutshell, there were many signs that SIS knew that there was a person in Dunedin accessing the Oslo Manifesto. So that SIS is the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service. They were notified by an international spy agency that there was someone in Dunedin accessing the Oslo Manifesto. The Oslo Manifesto is the complete, comprehensive, whatever you want to call it, gospel type of thing. The complete text on how to convince yourself to carry out the attack, how to go about it, what things to do, what drugs to take to build your body up, what guns to buy, what modifications to make. It has a few hundred pages of summary on the Islamic religion, not a very accurate one, of course, but it has everything. It's a one-stop shop. The Oslo Manifesto is a one-stop shop to go from being a normal human being to a terrorist. The New Zealand SIS knew that because they were told that there is a man in Dunedin accessing the Oslo Manifesto. And they also told the New Zealand SIS that that person was also accessing something to do with Magpul parts, MAGPUL, which is the main modification that takes your gun from just being a standard gun, legal gun, to being a semi-automatic killing machine, where people who died in Christchurch had a very small hole in their body, but because of the way things were configured, that small entry point became a 0% chance of survival because of the way it ripped through their organs and how quickly they bled to death. Even if the ambulances had arrived, even if they had received immediate medical attention, their survivability will still be zero, pretty much zero. And that was all because he was following the Oslo Manifesto. So the long point there is that the Royal Commission has still not given any answers to the families as to why the SIS didn't tell the police. The police had no clue because the SIS didn't tell them. No one had any clue. The gun club had no clue. No one had a clue. He was getting signs all over the place. He was going to his doctor with a moon face, which shows that you're on testosterone drugs and all that. He shot himself in the face or whatever it was. He was shooting erratically at the gun club. He had all sorts of illegal modifications and doing all sorts of funny things at the gun club. He had a dodgy gun license with no real person attached to it. There was only a virtual friend that he had for the gun license. The gun license lady, the police lady, who we actually now know was a very solid checker of licenses, never had a clue from the SIS. But the point is that, yes, families have moved on. They have had no answers to any of that, but they've moved on. So that's just the way I suppose it works, because how long do you wait for people to give you answers? So they moved on. I had 5 people come to the meeting, even though I had really good updates, like we're working hard on it, but they can't be bothered anymore. So I suppose, yeah, that's how it is. They can't make it easy for them. I think that about wraps it up.
It's so great to hear you speak, but just one more question. You mentioned before the restorative justice system in New Zealand, which started maybe 30 years ago in the 80s. And from what I gather, in the very early days, there were Māori leaders and some faith leaders who were sort of running a system that was more restorative and struck that balance between blaming the offender as evil and just blaming society, but actually tried to put a community around them and bring them together, achieving a whole variety of things. And that met initially really good success with youth offenders particularly, but as that's got rolled out to a state system, it's sort of a lot more questionable whether it's done much, but it certainly had an important role. Do you think that our faith communities and ethnic communities could be looking at other ways, initiatives like that, which could be brought into the justice system? And do you think it's realistic for us to do that, given our resources, and what would be your priority areas of things that you think our faith communities could maybe move into? You mentioned before when people come out of prison and the support there. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so the restorative justice issue, yes, we can do small things and we can try and, like bolt them on to the wider system. But the problem with the reason why those things haven't really had much effect is because, more widely, is because the system itself, restorative justice by its nature brings in other philosophies and other non-Western aspects, elements. And the problem is the system is so resistant to any of that making any headway. They just sort of keep it on the side as a sort of a bell or a whistle, or just an accessory. And that's the reason why. So anyway, the short answer is yes, we can do little things, important things. for example, having a family violence restorative justice-based system, which can bring in those things. So at least starting with where he's accepted his offending, and then you have a Muslim restorative justice process, at the very least, That's going to be valuable. That's like a very small thing that we can do, I think. But we've also got to keep knocking on the system's door to say, hey, have you considered any other legal traditions yet? For things that are consistent with our culture. We're not saying that suddenly that would be obviously wrong to introduce alien concepts to a New Zealand law system or way of life or whatever you want to call it, a general understanding of the common people. But there are many things which can be introduced and benefited from in order to make actually the law more credible in the eyes of a diverse community. So you have to do both. We've got to do the easy ones, which is like little steps that we can do, but we also have to have advocacy knocking on the door and saying, humility, but also just necessity in this day and age requires that we've got to diversify our legal philosophy. New Zealand has to do it, then other countries have to do it, international law has to do it, and to be honest, we can directly improve the welfare, the well-being of millions of people if we have a more humility around our own legal tradition and we make it more inclusive of other legal traditions, because suddenly more and more countries will start following the law. But yeah, sorry, there's no easy answer. We've got to do it at all levels. And restorative justice is just the reason why it's remained at the fringes is because it brings in basically stuff that wasn't part of what we see, so people see it as, it's just one of those fluffy, soft things which, just kind of everyone gets nice and happy about for a little, but it's not really a legal thing, because it's not from our own core legal tradition.
How we focus on solutions instead of just focusing on the problem itself. Sorry, I was just going to ask, and I know it's getting late, but just how we focus on moving forward from here, because obviously meetings like this, they're good to bring awareness about these issues, but how do we, just not follow what was being done before, setting meetings, just talking about the problems, actually figuring out methodology, a process, how you can, go forward and change it.
Awesome. That's a good one to end on, maybe? So the question just for the online folks was just, how do we move forward with a problem-solving approach from this meeting? More or less that. So maybe just to touch on that last question, that would be one area. Family violence is close to home. It's close to our faiths, families. Sadly, family violence is also close to our home, unfortunately, as we know, in all traditions, all cultures. And when I look at the court list, unfortunately, it stands out a lot more because our names stand out a lot more on the court list, and usually it's more than often than not it's family violence. Obviously, there are Polynesian names on that list every day. There are other cultural names, but the Muslim names, and they're often in the A's for some reason when I have to get the first page, that they stand out. And that could be an area that we could look into in terms of having restorative justice available. I think Peter's point is a really important one. Before anyone actually accepts any guilt, so how are the police turning up to family violence incidents? And what's happening? So, do we have some clarity around the role of some of these? You might call them. They're often called victim refuge or other organisations like that. Can we get more understanding around their processes so that whānau are not feeling, or communities are not feeling excluded by those agencies? So I think that would be one practical area, maybe just focusing on that family violence aspect, and also after they've accepted responsibility, having appropriate counselling for them, or appropriate. So maybe through that model, maybe if we can get that right, that will be a basis for us saying at a higher level of advocacy, hey, that really worked. So maybe we can look at a wider approach in other areas as well. But to be honest, I am saying that we've still got to repeat that advocacy, which is basically in a way repeating the problem. But people like I mentioned before, like Moana Jackson, had to keep doing that until he died. Why? Because nothing changed. And the sad part is that we're in a situation where we can't. There is limited opportunity to change, but we have to increase that through civil society. So, that we would say that's a very Islamic tradition. that the way that we were able to, do great things was to actually build the building blocks, the institutions. So we have to do that first, is to actually connect with our neighbours, understand, think about the law, how it might apply to people of other backgrounds, other faiths, and then advocate together for law change and for law improvement. So really what I'm saying today is you have to do more talking at that level, but you can also do practical things like the family violence-based stuff in terms of restorative justice and family harm incidents. Thank you very much, Brendan. I think we'll stop there. That's a solid hour, isn't it?
Yes, thank you very much. Join me in thanking Aarif. It's been a really challenging, thought-provoking talk, and your response to our questions. Very daunting about some of the challenges that we face as among minority communities around the country, and then the challenge as people of faith to respond to that in an appropriate way. So thank you so much, Aarif, for putting yourself on the spot with all the questions, and thank you all for joining us.